thank you so much for doing this again. I would introduce you again, sir, but things get glorious every time, right? Every time I'm here, I'm so excited to talk about things. And this one I've been preparing for quite a bit. I mentioned in the last podcast too. And part of the reason is one very interesting inflection point in my history was this small lecture I attended once in the Faridabad RSS Shakha. My father, and in fact, my father's business partner, my uncle, they probably were allowed the education and the future because they were funded by RSS Shakha schools back in the day, right? They were very poor families. And so my family's always been involved. And my father once took me to a lecture. Turns out, in hindsight, that this was by Mr. Ram Madhav. I had no idea. I had no context on any of this. I was maybe 15, 16. And the entire lecture was about how China employs Sun Tzu's art of war in its foreign policy, internal policy, and why we must look inwards for inspiration. And this is like 15 years ago, I think, not 20 years ago, but 15 years ago. So a significant time ago where the current political context or the current political discourse was not this prominent. And so that made me wonder, why can we not do that with our thinkers? And one name strikes in particular, which is Chanakya, Kautilya, Vishnugupta, and the several names that sort of follow for a man of his stature. So what I wanted to do through this podcast is figure out, if you were to place Chanakya in modern times, if you were to think of a Chanakya Niti for today, how would that happen? Is that a fair proposal, sir, for the conversation?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
And first of all, thank you for having me back on your show. Yes, Vishnugupta Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, was a seminal character in our history.
Right.
He was a philosopher, but very importantly, he was also an empire builder. He was one of the two founders of the Mauryan Empire,
Right.
our first really big empire in India. And he also has left behind to us a manual on governance called the Arthashastra, which is very well known, which is something that he wrote when he was probably a professor of political economy in Takshashila University. And then later on perhaps edited it when he became the Prime Minister of the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta Maurya.
So before we begin,
Yes.
let me just get the historical situation straight, because I know for a fact he was born to a Brahmin family and then somebody said that he's going to be very powerful and stuff like that. But I didn't know he was a professor at Takshila. So give me a little bit of historical context on the
So
family.
there are many legends about him.
Right.
So it's a long time ago. So there are many legends that his father, Chanak, and hence Chanakya, was a minister in the Nanda Empire, and then he was, removed from his post, and they were exiled, and so on. There are many legends. Not all of them are consistent. We do know, however, that at some point in time, and this from here on it becomes a little more certain, he turned up essentially at the time of Alexander's invasion as a professor in Takshashila of political economy. He was quite a famous person at that time. Now, at the time of Alexander's invasion, what happens is that Alexander makes an ally out of Ambi, who was the ruler of Takshashila. Now, there is, however, opposition to this, led primarily by the intellectuals, and many of them are then hanged. In that milieu, Kautilya, or Chanakya if you prefer, runs away from there and goes all the way to Magad to ask for help from the Nanda king. Now the Nanda king basically insults him and throws him out of the Sabha. So he then sort of heads back to Takshashila. Now there are again many legends about this, but at some point in time he takes under his wing a boy from a relatively poor background. There are again many legends who this person was. Some say it was just a poor kid he found along the way. Some people say he was an illegitimate son of the Nanda king. All kinds of rumors are there. But anyway, the net result is that a young boy called Chandragupta Maurya under his tutelage. And he takes this boy back to Takshashila, by which point Alexander has come and he's gone.
Okay.
And northwest of India is under the Greeks at this point. He then, some more years pass, he educates this young boy to become the ideal ruler. It is possibly also around about that time when he puts together his thoughts on how a new empire could be put together. And then with the support of hill tribes, which are probably from Himachal. We're just guessing here.
Right.
He then finally manages to essentially evict the Nandas from the plains and ultimately from Magad. And then he creates a somewhat bigger empire and attacks the Greeks and evicts them from northwest of India, and then lays the foundation thereafter of what we know as the Mauryan Empire. So this is the rough sketch of what we know about this person.
Fair.
But it is important that there are many legends about him, not just in his own time, and of course the book that he's left behind, the Arthashastra. But subsequent centuries, you keep having mention of this person, called Vishnugupta, Chanakya or Kautilya, who was a great philosopher, guru of Chandragupta and so on. So even in the Gupta Empire, you have a great philosopher, thinker of that time called Kamandak. So Kamandak. Kamandak in his Niti Sara, right in the beginning, starts with salutations to Chanakya of Vishnugupta, who had set up this great empire. So hundreds of years later, they are still thinking about this great person. And they, the Guptas had plays, for example, Mudra Rakshas, in which in the play, there is a description of all the intriguing that happened when Chanakya and Chandragupta were evicting the Nandas. And they had a very loyal chief minister under the Nandas called Rakshasa. And how the two of them, they intrigue against each other, and ultimately Chanakya wins. So the Guptas were very fascinated with the Mauryas, and they were particularly fascinated with Chanakya and Chandragupta. After all, in the Guptas, remember, there are at least 3 emperors named after Chandragupta. So it was a common name.
Yes.
Similarly, you can see Kamandak names Vishnugupta as one of the great scholars of the past. So there's this great fascination with the Mauryas, with the Gupta empires, 600 years later. So when Samudragupta wants to write his Prashasti about his own conquests in the south and west and so on, where does he go? He finds a Ashokan pillar, which is now in
Qutub. Is that
no, it's not the one in Qutub. This is the one in Prayag.
Okay.
And on that column, where Ashoka's inscriptions are, in the same column, Samudragupta leaves his inscription. Why? Because he is trying to signal continuity. It's not like he was also a great empire. He could have also got hold of a slab of stone. It's not like he was running. He was lacking stone. So why does he go there? Because again, this continuity that is being done.
Right. And just to get it historically accurate, I think there's a significant sort of several 100-year difference between the Gupta Empire, which is in the future, and the Mauryan Empire, which is in the past.
Yes, Mauryan Empire is 300 BC, thereabouts. And you are talking about the Gupta Empire in 300 to 500 AD. So there's a good 600.
Which is a long time, because if I reflect right now, that's like the 1200s for now, right? In context.
No, 600 back, so 1400.
Yeah, 1400. But my point is that and we know this, right? Because at least my history book taught me. And my history book also confused me between the Mauryan and the Gupta Empire, but that's a separate issue. There was something unique about the Mauryan Empire. It was known as a great empire. And although the word great is whatever, but I'm trying to understand what is so special about the Mauryan Empire. Guys, my first book just came out, and I'm taking 1 second to interrupt your viewing to tell you about it. This is the first book I ever wrote. It's available on Amazon. It's called Don't Shut Up. It's a cheat sheet on how to handle the social world between your 20s and your 30s and what to do in situations where you might otherwise be confused. Go check it out. Tell me what you think.
Well, it's the first historical empire for which we have a lot of evidence, archaeological, textual, and so on. So there may have been empires before. Even, for example, the Namdas also had an empire, not as large, but it was an empire. But it's very, very sketchy. So what we know about it actually comes from their enemies who replaced them, the Mauryas.
Right, okay.
There are legends about, from our epics, for example, that, they may have been great kings. Raja Bharat, who may have conquered in Jambu Dvipa and so on. But other than mention in the text, I cannot say anything very definitive about it. But with the Mauryas, what happens, they are the first proper empire for which we definitely know. And there are, there's Megasthenes who comes, for example.
Right.
So there is external validation and evidence for it. So we know definitely these guys existed. They had a bunch of emperors. We have some description of the empire. We have the Arthashastra, which gives some flavor of how that empire may have been run. This is a manual, so I'm not saying that the actual empire may not have run exactly like this. But nevertheless, it provides some flavor of the kind of thinking that the prime minister of that state had.
Right. And so this oft seen nostalgia towards the golden age of India, is that historically rightfully placed around this time? Is it like, if I were to look back at the Mauryan Empire, is that part of the golden age of India? Was it very rich?
I was very careful about using the word golden age because different parts of India flourished at different points for different reasons. So India has a long history with many golden ages. You can say the Harappan period was also sort of golden age. You had this period under the Mauryas that different places may have had. For example, Agra's golden age was under the Mughals.
Right.
Southern India had a golden age under Krishnadevaraya and the Vijayanagar Empire.
Right.
Bengal may have had a golden age under the Palas and the Sens, and so on and so forth. So we have to be a little careful about the use of this word golden age,
right?
Because it gives the impression that
there was one
golden age, and so we have a long cyclical history with all kinds of things happening at different points in time.
And is this empire particularly rich? Is the Mauryan Empire? Is there something to look at in the Mauryan Empire?
Well, certainly it was very big.
Okay,
so it was it was much bigger than, for example, the Republic of India.
Oh, right.
Yes. So you have to remember that other than the very tip of southern India, everything else in the subcontinent, not just India, but what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, even parts of eastern Iran were part of this empire. It was a massive empire. So it was significantly bigger than modern India. And an empire of that size remained in play for 3 generations. Of course, with Ashoka at the end of his life, it had already begun to fall apart. But still, for 3 generations, this rather massive empire held together.
The size of a modern country and more, right?
Yes, much bigger than India. It would have been the biggest empire on the planet at its height.
Fair.
And Alexander's empire, for example, didn't last at all, because he conquered it and then on his way back he died.
Right.
So his empire was almost immediately carved up between his generals. So the Alexandrian Empire didn't exist it existed for just a few years and wasn't properly administered as such, as a single unit. His contemporaries in China as well. That was the time that China, just a little bit later, China had its first empire as well. It was smaller. In fact, modern China is much, much bigger than the first empire of China. Whereas modern India is smaller than the first empire of
Very
India.
interesting. And I would think, this would be my guess, given what I have understood or what I've read a little bit, right? That a great degree of this huge empire that came to be came from the smarts of one man, right? Maybe it's an overlap. Two men.
Yeah.
So him and Chandragupta both.
Yes,
They're co-founders of sorts.
They are co-founders. I think, Chandragupta must have been a remarkable man. Because not only, he was an empire, and he must have been the military brains, the inspirational figure.
Right.
His guru may have been Chanakya and may have provided him the intellectual framework, but a great empire requires personality, character, inspiration, genius,
Leadership.
military leadership. All of those things probably came from Chandragupta Maurya. So it is almost certainly, we don't know very much exactly, but it was almost certainly a very close relationship between the two.
Right. And wasn't Chanakya also a prime minister for Bindusara?
We don't know all these details.
Acha.
Do remember that Chanakya was significantly older than Chandragupta. So he may have carried on for a little while into Bindusara, but certainly would not for much longer.
Okay, so now that I have a historical account and I understand sort of the length and breadth of what he'd managed to establish, my question is, what is the right way to look at Chanakya? Is he a political philosopher, which is probably what an Arthashastra represents? Is he a kingmaker, what is now commonly termed as a power broker of sorts? Like, how do I place Chanakya in my mind?
So obviously, even in tradition, his different aspects have different names. So when we talk of him as a philosopher, usually the word Kautilya is used.
Okay.
Therefore, it's called Kautilya's Arthashastra, not Chanakya's Arthashastra, usual usage.
Mm-hmm.
And Chanakya or Vishnugupta Chanakya is used for him as an administrator and empire builder. So he was an empire builder. He was also an administrator. So he was a practitioner and a philosopher. So the Arthashastra is a document of his philosophy, which is, of course, was informed by the fact that he was a practitioner. And you can clearly see that. I mean, he has very specific injunctions about, what should the traffic rules be and the fines should be, what interest rate should be. So this is not just a guy writing general principles. He then, here are the principles and here is what the rules should be. So he's quite clear in that.
Very specific.
Very specific. So this is very different, by the way, from most other books. In fact, for hundreds of years afterwards, there are even his followers of later times like Kamandak, etc. are not as specific. He is very specific. He's very specific about how a town should be built, what is the width of the road, all these kinds of specifications he gives. I mean, what interest rate should be given? If a person takes a loan and he renege, what is the procedure for insolvency and bankruptcy?
It's in the same book.
It's in the same book. Here it is. It's a thick book.
Thick book.
It's a thick book. This is a translation by Vachaspati Garola. So this is a pretty thick document. This is the English version of it.
Right.
Although this is edited down, but this is the commonly used one by Ranganathan. But you can have other versions of it as well. But point is, it's a thick book, and it gets into real details about how a military camp should be set up. What are the principles for engaging in foreign policy? For example, he has the mandala theory.
Okay.
So the mandala theory is if you can think of yourself as a state, as a kingdom, and then you have kingdoms with whom you have borders. So one of his points he makes is that those with whom you share borders are very likely to be your enemies. But that principle also applies to them on the other side.
Right.
So very often your highest likelihood of your ally is going to be the kingdom on the other side of him. Things like that. So
the enemy of your enemy is a friend.
Enemy of your friend. So there are all these principles he has there. So similarly, he has all these. He talks about the various kinds of knowledge you need to run an empire. What are the principles of governance? So the book Arthashastra should be called. It's a treatise on governance and prosperity.
Okay.
And so he has in here very specifically talks about what are the areas of knowledge you need to know and to run an empire. And in this sense, it is a much wider book than Machiavelli's Prince, which is a very narrow book about doing court politics in a small state in Italy.
Yes.
It's trivial almost compared to the thinking level of Kautilya.
I was going to get into that because very often, the Western mind and probably the Western sort of view on this situation is that Chanakya is some kind of an equivalent to Machiavelli. And it seems like the Prince, which is largely this political psychology document of like, how do you manage to ascend to power? And this is
mostly about court intrigue.
Yes, right. This is way more specific.
Oh yeah, it's a much more sophisticated document. I mean, it does have something about court intrigue and spies and so on. But frankly, that is a very small part of it. I mean, it also has urban design discussion. It has a discussion on how to deliver justice. It has discussion how to regulate bad sectors, vice sectors. What to do about alcohol and
I see.
And how to regulate prostitution. All kinds of very specific. What are the rights and how what are the limitations? How do you manage a forest? All of this is given very clearly written out. Here are the principles. Here are how to apply those principles.
I wonder why could we not call it to some degree akin to a constitution? Like how is this different from a constitution?
No, it's not a constitution because it's more like a manual.
Okay.
A constitution would be slightly different because it would then have high level principles about how to
further create manuals.
Not just that, it would also talk about how the king should be elected, what are the principles. It doesn't get into that.
Right.
It assumes the existence of a state.
Okay.
And then it talks about the existence of and how that state should be governed once it is in existence. So I think it's better thought of as a governance manual.
Okay. Let me ask you a somewhat animated question. And so treat it like an animated question. Add your sincerity to it. Imagine I were to place Chanakya today in India, a rising economy, without question, much better than it has ever been in history. Almost like the last time we discussed, at the cusp of something great happening, right? And with all of these raw material in place, with a stable population in place, what would Chanakya do first, or what would be the highest point of leverage from a Chanakyan point of view in present day policy or judiciary or XYZ ABC? Like, how would Chanakya approach present day?
So you'll have to really let me lay out how Chanakya thought about the role of the state.
Let's go.
So first of all, you have to understand that Chanakya is not functioning in a vacuum. Okay, so by the time Chanakya appears on the scene, there is a well-established learning institutions like Takshashila, where he teaches, and there already exist pre-existing theories of governance and so on. And even you see that in the epics, for example, you have discussions about it. So what is the principle or what is the basis of thinking about the state in Indian philosophy? Well, the main, very important concept is that of Matsya Nyaya. So what is Matsya Nyaya? Matsya Nyaya is the law of the fish.
Right.
The large fish eats the
Small fish.
So this is the basic idea of Jungle Raj. Now, how do you avoid Jungle Raj? That is why the state exists, to avoid Jungle Raj. So there are different theories on how to avoid Jungle Raj. So pre-existing already, there were philosophers of the school of Brihaspati and there was the school of Shukra. They were somewhat different philosophers.
These are also authors of the past.
They are authors of the past. We have some very corrupt, highly corrupted documents of those philosophies still in existence, but frankly, you can't make out what exactly is going on. So we don't really know exactly what they say, except from what
Chanakya says
about them.
Right.
Anyway, now Chanakya says that in order for governance, you need basically to learn 4 areas of knowledge.
Okay.
So the first area of knowledge that you need is Dandaniti. Okay, this is rule of law and enforcement of that law, justice, that kind of thing. There's another area called Varta. Varta is economic policy. Okay. Third area of knowledge, you need an economic philosophy. So today, for example, we have capitalism, socialism, welfareism, etc. You need some philosophy to anchor your policies. And fourth area of knowledge is you have to be cognizant of the cultural context. He calls them Trei. Trei literally means the 3 Vedas, but he means it in the more general context of what is the cultural context. Okay. Now he tells us about different schools of thought. So he tells us that Shukra, the school of Shukra, is very much legalist.
Okay.
So their view is, if you want governance, if you want to avoid Matsya Nyaya, you have to set up the rules and then you have to have a system of administering the rules. That is the main thing that the state is there to do. Then there is the school of Brihaspati. Brihaspati agrees that rule of law, all of this is important, but he says you also need economic policy.
And what is the difference between economic policy and...
So, for example, in rule of law, I would just have a bunch of laws. I would have Supreme Court and the government would come up with a bunch of laws and Supreme Court would enforce it. But you won't have economic policy. You won't have, for example, the PLI scheme or various schemes that we have for promoting industry.
Interest rate, special economic zones.
Yeah, all of that kind of thing. Shukra would say no.
So no nudges.
No nudges or even interventions or policies. You just create a law and once you have the law, it's like almost you step back and...
So is subsidy or like subsidizing a part of Varta in that case?
Yes, a subsidy is via Varta.
Okay.
Or economic or ease of doing business, for example.
Right.
All of this would be Varta.
And then the Nyaya Samiti or the CRPC, they will be all law. They will be all Dandaniti.
That's Dandaniti,
right,
yes.
Right.
So Shukra would be very suspicious of any kind of interventionism or any economic policy at all.
Okay.
He said once you created the law, you have a law of contract. I have a contract with you. Whatever happens. If the government comes and says that no, I'm going to give you a PLI scheme for helping you to expand your business, Shukra would say no, bad idea. But Brihaspati would say no, good idea.
Good idea. Okay, fair.
Now there is the school of Manu.
Okay.
Manu says that yes, you need to have the wider context. You need some philosophy on the way. But Manu, by the way, can be, we don't know exactly which Manu, but Manu, remember, is a title of a lawgiver.
Okay.
So there have been many Manus in history. So the Manu Smriti that people talk about is of one Manu.
Okay.
So today, the lawgiver is Manu. So
It's like judge. It's like justice.
Yeah.
Kind of like justice so and so.
Yeah. So some Manu, or the school of Manu, he doesn't tell you which Manu, they are of the view that no, you need some other philosophical framework. And Manu thinks that the philosophical framework should largely come from the cultural context.
Okay.
Then finally, you have
the cultural context being Trai. Just to be specific. Yeah,
he doesn't separate the two.
Oh, okay.
As far as he's concerned, Anavikshi and Trai, the same thing.
Same thing.
Then comes Kautilya and he says, no, you need law, you need economic policy, you need a philosophy, and you separately need to understand the cultural context in which all of this is going to play out. So this is how he thinks about it. Now, having placed this on the front
table. Yes.
Now let's get into what does Kautilya think the role of the state is. So one of the things that he keeps talking about, saying that the king must be restrained in his in how he interacts with the economy, people, etc. So he likes to limit the state. Okay, and so what Chanakya argues for is a strong but limited state, in which the state has the following role. It has a role in internal and external security. It has a role in enforcing contracts and justice, which is the Dandaniti part, regulating industry, providing infrastructure, also providing safety nets during national disasters, so disaster management and relief. So these are the kinds of things, or issuance of currency, monetary policy. These are the kinds of things that Chanakya thinks is the role of the state. He is, however, extremely suspicious of bureaucrats.
Okay. Bureaucrats being the gentlemen like yourself?
Yeah.
Right.
He's very, very suspicious. Yeah. So he says that, look, we need a bureaucracy, we need officials to do all these state things.
Right.
But he's extremely suspicious of them. In fact, throughout the thing, there are a lot of things about spies.
Right.
And very often people tend to take this business of spies as if in the Machiavellian sense of court intrigue. No. Kautilya spies are mostly employed against officials.
His bureaucrats.
Because he suspects them all the time. He basically states that just like it is impossible to tell how much water a fish is drinking when it's in the water, it is impossible to know how much an official is skimming off money from official funds.
So he treats that as a given, huh?
It's given. These guys are thugs. Now, I need these people to do these things.
Right.
But I need to limit these fellows, because if I may use them to do too many things, they will begin to basically
drink too much water.
Right. So he then does something interesting. He then, therefore, everywhere he makes sure that the state does not extend to doing anything. So he is not a welfareist, for example. So if you did too many welfare schemes, Kautilya would take the view that this would overextend the state, and all this extra money you think you are spending on the poor and all of this all get. So again, once in a while when there is a national disaster, you have to help the people. You do it. You build infrastructure for them. But by and large, you limit these bureaucrats. They are an extremely suspicious bunch.
Fellows, right.
Yeah. So this is his view of what the state should do. So a strong but limited state. So I want to distinguish between libertarians from the Western sense who want a very minimal weak state. This is not what Kautilya is about. Kautilya wants a strong but limited state. So, the things that the state does, he has no sense of humor.
Okay. What does that mean? He has no sense of humor? It means
there are certain things he thinks the state should do.
And
like for internal security.
Right.
He has no sense of humor about it.
Okay.
So he's not a libertarian or minimal state guy.
Right.
He just says there are some things that the state will do, and this is what it will do, and I have no sense of humor in this. Outside of it, jo bhi hai. For example, he's not in favor of prohibition, for example.
Okay. So no ban on alcohol.
No. He will regulate it,
okay,
but will not ban it. So he usually would think that over extending the state is bad. You regulate those things. So he has lots of regulations of trade, of all kinds of things.
But he has no bans per se.
He doesn't like bans.
He seems very skeptical of corruption because prohibitions lead to...
Yes. So in fact, this is an interesting thing in terms of political philosophy.
Right.
See, the limits on the state in the Western conception comes from ideas of from the idea of inalienable rights of individuals.
Right.
Okay, that's where the roots of Western ideas of limiting the state.
Right.
The Indian idea of limiting the state comes from the other side, from the idea that if you allow officials too much power, they will misuse it.
So it is that the institution is too corrupt in its large form versus that the individual has inalienable rights.
It may lead you to similar outcomes.
Right.
But I'm just telling you where Kautilya would have come to it.
Right.
Now, coming to your point about what would Kautilya do if he came today.
Right.
If he turned up today, I think he would be, he would like many of our policies. He would be a little skeptical about some of our Antodaya type schemes, which we help the very poor, etc. He would think of that as being unnecessary. He would say that you run the country well, it will grow and solve the problem. So that is the view probably he would take. So he wouldn't approve of some of our direct benefit transfer type of things. I don't think he would. But I think that would be a minor issue compared to the way we run our judiciary. I think that he would be furious.
We've gotten to this point the last time too. Tell me more, huh?
Yeah, so he would say that, look, you're doing all these other welfare stuff, whereas the main purpose of the state is to deliver justice. You aren't able to do this. You do all the other stuff later on. Get the judiciary to work. Yeah.
The rule of law to actually work.
The rule of law, as far as he's concerned, the rule of law is the problem. He said you want to help the poor. Well, the poor, in Matsya Nyaya, the big fish are always eating the small fish. If you really care for the poor, you have to get the judicial system to work.
Right.
That is his view of how to help the poor.
So he would diagnose that the process is the punishment when it comes to the law.
Yes, he would say, look, how is this, justice? You have to have a just system. The delivery of justice is important. All this other welfare stuff you're doing is actually you are
overcompensation of sorts.
You're compensating for your inefficiency in doing something that the state basically should do. He would have no sense of humor about law and order problems, for example.
Right.
So he was very much, dandaniti, law has to be imposed, justice has to be done, the infrastructure has to be good. I mean, he talks a lot about highways have to be there. So he would have approved definitely of our highway building, our airports.
Right.
So those kinds of things he would have approved of. But he would definitely been very skeptical about our delivery of justice.
Right. Let me ask you a somewhat tricky question because I put you in an animated position first. But when you said this about the rule of law and say the issue with delivering justice, which honestly is the issue because I have no social security net no matter how wealthy or influential I am, because the minute things go wrong, the courts will take 25 years or 8 years or 12 months to even begin delivering justice, right? And that seems to be a very reasonable issue.
So Kautilya would have been furious about this.
Right, but is that a real concern that you share with Kautilya?
Yes, I share with that at all. Absolutely. If I had to, I definitely would argue that the single biggest constraint to India's current economic expansion is now the enforcement of contracts. We've got 47 million cases stuck in our legal system. What on earth are we talking about? This is, in my view, the one big problem of...
so the highest point of leverage.
Yes, so I would totally agree with Kautilya on his views on this.
And how does one go about solving it? Like, I'm sorry, this is a little off track again, and maybe this is...
No, we need to do a lot of things. I mean, this cannot be done by the government. I mean, ultimately, the judiciary has to really stand up
and do it. It's a separate institution.
It's a separate institution. Yes, the government has to do it, but ultimately the judiciary has to do it itself.
Right.
Whether it's the appointment of judges, the infrastructure, the procedures, a medieval way in which the entire system works. It's just astounding. The long holidays it goes on. I mean, you've got to be kidding.
The loss of paperwork.
Yeah,
the paperwork gets lost sometimes.
No. So all of this is inexcusable, and Kautilya would have been absolutely furious about it.
Okay. One of the modern problems that plagues India, or is often referred to as plaguing India by colloquial people like myself, people who are not as educated on the problems as yourself, is that one, we have a very big population almost at an unmanageable scale, and two, that there is so many areas of differentiation. We are different on caste, creed, race, gender, like there's so much heterogeneity in our population that it becomes sort of unmanageable from a policy or from a bureaucratic or from a government sort of standpoint. How do you think does a Kautilyan approach to that work, to managing such a huge country?
So obviously he was managing a massive country too. Of course, the problem is the Kautilya's Arthashastra is scale agnostic and may mostly have been written before he became running a government.
Okay.
So we don't really know what if his views changed after running the Mauryan Empire and setting it up and running it. But anyway, the fact of the matter is the Arthashastra does not give us a clear view on this. He does mention some things about Varna system, etc., but in very vague general terms. This is not really important to him at all. So he is talking more in terms of rule of law, rules of taxation, those kinds of things.
And he's treating subjects as the same, like
more or less, yes. Although there is some mention of Varna system in there. It's not important to it, but it does. There are some areas where he does mention it, and also
and there's
it has differential rules also for certain kinds of activities. But it is not central to his
thesis at
all.
Okay.
This is quite different from, say, Kamandak, who comes 600 years later in the Gupta Empire, and there it becomes a much more important part of the conversation.
So it grows in importance over the next 600
Number
years.
one, also interesting is that when in the cycle these two people wrote. So Kamandak is writing at the time when the Gupta Empire already existed for a couple of generations already. So Kamandak, for example, has this preference for well-born officials. Okay, so he has this preference. Why?
Of old money, for like old money officials, right?
Whereas Kautilya doesn't give a damn. Because he's first generation.
Himself, yes.
Right. And he's the king he is installed on the throne is also first generation. So there is all these other things you've got to be aware of, that they are at different points in the cycle. So similarly, caste has also become a more important part of the conversation by the time Kamandak appears on the scene and so on.
How about religion? Because I think Jainism and Buddhism is very much around by the time Chanakya.
Yes, but they are not. He's not particularly interested in religion as such. He may have been in personal life. We don't know.
Right.
But you can see he mentions temples and stuff like that along the way. But it's not something he directly alludes to as such. I mean, he gives examples here and there where you can, clearly derive from Sanatan lineage of thought. And so he's not really delving into Hindu philosophy or any kind of philosophy as such.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he almost assumes the existence of a Vedic Trayi-based system, but he doesn't get involved in really getting into the details of it.
Interesting. I have one last question about religion. And so my assumption is that the modern categorical differentiation between Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism is probably much more sort of recent than as ancient as this might be, right? Like so you're absolutely right. The differentiation between all of these things is actually an entirely modern and largely Abrahamic idea, because in Abrahamic construction of faiths, you have clear demarcations. In the world of Kautilya, these things may not have been meaningful way of thinking about it. There was a general dharma karma
kind of framework. For court rituals, for example, the Mauryans used to use Vedic rituals. But it doesn't mean that individuals had different ideas of things. For example, at least the Jains claim that Chandragupta towards the end of his life became a Jain.
Okay.
The Jains claim it.
Right.
Whether it's true or not, who knows? His son
Bindusara
was probably belonged to a sect called the Jivikas.
Okay.
His son
Ashoka.
By the way, his different sons seem to have had different interests, but Ashoka seemed to have had a preference for Buddhism. And then you have Dasharath, who Ashoka's son, who seemed to have gone back to being an Ajivika, and then one of his sons who went off to Kashmir, who was a Shaiva. So there seems to be quite a mix of things, and that seems to have been by and large the way things were in pre-modern Hinduism. Even today, you will see, you go to Golden Temple, you'll find lots of Sikhs, Hindus, lots of Hindus go there to worship.
Right.
Similarly, you go to Thailand, they worship Buddha, but you go to a Thai Buddhist temple,
Right.
you will find Ganesh, you will find
Vedic
Brahma,
rituals. Yeah.
Vedic rituals. Same thing happens in Japan as well. So there is a lot of mix and match. The demarcation between dharmic religions has never been that clear. And in fact may not even be meaningful.
Right. Fair. Okay. One more area of importance that sort of has become prominent in the last 5-7 years has been foreign policy and how we deal with sort of our neighbors and how we deal with external threats. Let's just put it like that, right? How would Kautilya conceptualize foreign policy, or how we deal with our neighbors? Is there something specific he says?
So I told you about the mandala theory. That is one of the theories, and he says that your main large countries with whom you share your borders are likeliest to be your
which is true for us,
enemies, which is sort of true for us as well.
Literally,
So your rivals, the guys you want to keep track of, are the countries with which you share your borders. Therefore, your natural allies, per the Mandala theory, would be the people who are on the other side of it.
Right.
So today it would be, on one side it would be Japan, on the other side it would be Afghanistan, Iran,
Right.
Tajikistan,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously it's not a hard and fast rule. I'm just giving you how that schema would have worked in his...
And at this point, borders have been separated. So like if China and India are in friction, America, who's obviously also in friction with China, sort of becomes an ally.
So it needn't be literally the literal border, land border. It may be in terms of
conflict of whatever
conflict of some sort. It may be the other side of whatever you're in conflict with.
Right.
So your enemy's enemy being your likeliest friend is a part of the mandala way of thinking. So you have to remember that Kautilya is essentially a realist. So much of what he says is basically practical rule of thinking. So for example, even on taxation, he states that, he gives these very interesting analogies. He says, the way you tax must be in the way a honeybee collects pollen from a flower.
So without destroying the flower.
Yeah, you collect what you need to, but the flower itself should not be destroyed. So there are many things in Kautilya where he lays out these principles. And then having laid out the principle, which many of these principles are still valid.
Right.
And then for his own times, he will then tell you, okay, this rate of taxation is good for this.
Is there a difference between direct and indirect taxes for in Kautilyan tax?
No, it's mostly direct tax.
Okay.
Indirect tax.
So on sale purchase.
It's on sales purchase, but there is direct tax on cultivators.
On cultivators, as in the agriculturists.
Agriculturists. They're a share of whatever. The king gets a share of what is grown.
A tithe.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
I'm not a tithe. Okay. I'm not certain whether that was what a tithe was.
Okay.
But it certainly is the case that the king has a share of what is grown on his lands.
Fair. Tell me, economically, and I've understood a little bit, right? With infrastructure development and limited state with some economic incentives, it sounds like a classic capitalist. Like it sounds like an Adam Smithian sort of approach to things.
Yes, although he did not probably have a conception of distribution of resources based on an invisible
hand.
Yeah,
right.
So I don't think he was thinking in efficiency terms.
Right.
He was merely reflecting how business is done in those times. India has always been a very capitalist society in that sense. Merchants have existed from Harappan times, Bronze Age, and so on.
Yeah, we've been trading through.
We have been trading throughout. So he takes it as given that a merchant-based system is what artisans and merchants are key to the economy.
Right.
They need infrastructure, but they also need to be regulated. So he's very much clear that, there are rules, metrology rules about weights, measures, rules about what happens if somebody cheats.
Okay.
He has rules about lending and what is considered a reasonable interest rate. What happens if somebody defaults.
Okay.
And so on. Who is supposed to pay if default? What happens? And so on. So there is a whole bunch of things that he talks about. What happens to inheritance? What happens if somebody goes away and disappears? After how much time can
the inheritors claim it?
Inheritors claim it, or even a wife can remarry.
Okay.
So, there are all kinds of many other things that are there and you can see his thinking process mostly quite pragmatic. Once you accept his realist
Frame of
reference,
yes.
he's basically pragmatist. So he has traffic rules.
Right.
So he has rules about what happens if a bullock cart misbehaves. Then very small children are not allowed to run a bullock cart. So there's a age cutoff. What happens if
That's funny.
All
You're
kinds.
not allowed to drive a bullock cart drunk. Like that's
Stuff like
probably
that. So he has these kinds of rules. I mean, I don't know if he has that specific rule.
Yeah, right.
But it would be quite in character for him to have these kinds of rules, and then specifically say so many coins, copper coins, panas or whatever, have to be paid if this. If he does drunk driving.
Very interesting.
I mean, as I said,
drunk riding in that
drunk
case.
driving or whatever. So he has all these kinds of rules, fines for doing blah blah blah.
There is a very colloquial notion of Sam Dam Dand Bhed, which is what sort of emerges in pop culture from Chanakya and probably from Arthashastra. How do you see its validity today as far as the state's role is concerned? Because
so this is not the part of the state's role. He gets into this kind of thing when he gets into the king's. What should the king think of in terms of retaining power? And in that context, he does bring out the fact that you have to have spies. You need to have. You have to be willing to send out. If necessary, you have to use assassins sometimes. So that is where the Machiavellian part comes in. It's a very small part, by the way, of the Arthashastra. It's a part of his being a realist. In every modern state also has departments of CIA, FBI, and all this kind of thing. So he also has that, but that's not the starting point of his thinking.
Right.
And that is why I think it's quite unfair to just make him like a Machiavelli. He's not a Machiavelli at all.
Yeah, I think the sort of public Indian mind is so moralist in its initial conception that the reality of what he's saying strikes us as like, acha, like he has this whole Sam Dam Dand Bhed model to
yeah, he brings that up in the context of what is being done.
Right.
So you need to have an intelligence agency, and the intelligence agency does these kinds of things.
Right.
So this is the context in which he also talks about warfare and the kinds of formations that you should have for going to battle. In that context, he also talks about surprise as a
there is a moment of Troy kind of a situation.
So
that
he talks about all of this. So so that's about warfare.
Right.
So in that context, of course, surprise attacks are an important part of
right.
toolkit.
I think the story goes there is a fight they're having. I think this is on the rise of Chandragupta, and he goes to the kingdom and says that if you stop burning these candles, the enemy will retreat, and as soon as
look, there are many legends this. They are not.
Right.
These legends are not there in the Arthashastra itself.
Fair.
So they may be stories which actually happened, or they may just be apocryphal stories that are attached to him later on. We don't know.
Fair.
They are not there in the actual text.
Okay. As an epilogue to what we've come to sort of speak about, I want to understand what happens to Chanakya's thought, because he, as a co-founder of one of the greatest empires, and with him, Chandragupta, his son Bindusara, seems to have continued it. But it seems to die down with Ashoka. And we were just speaking right before we switched on the cameras about how you see Ashoka as the anti-Chanakya.
Yes.
Which is not how Ashoka the Great and the Ashok Chakra and all these things come to be understood in my history.
Absolutely. So people do need to understand that Ashoka violates pretty much everything that Chanakya stood for. So first of all, Ashoka, by the way, comes to power by usurping the throne and killing all his brothers. Having come to power, he then converts to Buddhism. We don't know exactly why, but my own sense is that because there were all these other Ajivikas and Jains and others in it. So there must have been various factions. He was from the Buddhist faction. And so very early on in his, after becoming king, he becomes a Buddhist. This happens at least 4 years before this, his invasion of Kalinga.
Which is the famous...
Yes.
Yeah, right.
This whole business of him converting after seeing the
dead bodies
right. in Kalinga is completely made up. There is no evidence of this at all. So the evidence is very clear that 4 years before this invasion, he was already a Buddhist. Now, he carries out the invasion of Kalinga, etc. But also important to know that there is no evidence of him becoming a pacifist either after the Kalinga War. In the inscription that is very often quoted about his pacifism, he basically says that, look, I invaded Kalinga, I killed so many people, I did all these bad things, I'm feeling sorry. But the very next line he says, if you forest tribes behave badly, I will do the same thing to you.
And then feel sorry again.
Yeah, so the point is it's a threat.
Right.
If you read the full inscription, it's clearly a threat.
Okay.
And there are many texts, including Sri Lankan Buddhist texts, which clearly mention that well into his rule, he was carrying out massacres of Ajivikas and Jains and others as well. So there is enough evidence of him doing that. But that is not just what I want to talk about as far as the issue of principles is concerned.
Right.
Ashoka was very much about expanding the state.
So an expansionist.
He was, of the powers of the state. So I talked about a limit, not the borders of his state, which already he had basically inherited.
Right.
Even Kalinga, by the way, was almost certainly a rebellious province.
Okay.
He didn't actually conquer it afresh. Now, the expansion of the role of the state is what Ashoka's contribution is.
Fair. So the powers of the state.
Yes.
Right.
So you read Ashoka, he talks about how, he wants his Rajukas, his Dharma Mahamantas to go out there and basically it's all about very much Mai Baap Sarkar.
Achha,
And he literally describes it. So he says, just like a parent hands over his or her baby to a wet nurse, in the same way, I am handing over my people to the care of my officials.
Like the bureaucratic officials.
The bureaucratic officials, including the Dharma Mahamantas, who basically are religious police.
Okay.
Now he has all these very interfering kinds of rules, which would be anathema to Kautilya. So, for example, he'll say, on the first day of Tissa and the fourth day of Chaturmasi, we should not castrate animals and so on. I mean, I really don't think the bull cared on which day he was castrated.
Right.
And so Chanakya would have been horrified by all of this. We thought of this as, unnecessary rules.
Right.
Because his rules are very realist rules. So all this kind of
excessive superstitious rules being
all this kind of soft stuff he anyway thinks is fishy.
Yeah. He's like, leave it to the people.
Leave it to the people, and anyway you're allowing free range to officials. You've got to be kidding me. These fellows are
the problem.
The problem.
Yes.
So Ashoka expands and lets basically this hugely expansionist, interventionist state. And so you end up with basically, meanwhile, obviously all of this requires fiscal expansion. So what happens, and we know that by the time you're well into the second half of Ashoka's rule, there is massive fiscal stress on the system. And so you have this increasingly weak but overextended state. And ultimately, by the time Ashoka dies, the Mauryan Empire collapses. So it is important to remember that the Mauryan Empire collapsed while Ashoka was alive.
Is it said otherwise? Historically, is it known otherwise?
Yes, it is very well known. But very often when we are saying Ashoka the Great, do remember what Ashoka is doing. He did not create the empire. He inherited it.
And that
in fact, he usurped it.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And then he overextends the state. And in his own lifetime, that empire collapses. So I have always found it bizarre that Ashoka is considered the great. If anyone, in fact, in the Indian tradition, the idea of him being Ashoka the Great is completely modern. It's a 19th but mostly 20th century idea. He was mostly forgotten in the Indian tradition, and to the extent he's remembered as Ashoka the Cruel, Chanda Ashoka. The idea of him being a great is in other parts of the world where his missionaries, etc. went. But those places had never
dealt with him.
Dealt with his rule.
Right.
In India itself, there are not even Buddhist texts that say that he was a great king.
Okay.
And, the Puranas, etc. barely mention him as a ruler. But to the extent they mention him, in passing, he is basically mentioned as Chanda Ashoka.
But then, why is there an official, like the flag right behind you?
Yes.
I if I'm not wrong, the chakra in the middle is the Ashoka chakra.
So
right?
this is something we need to have a discussion about.
Okay.
So first of all, you have to know that in the early part of the 20th century, there was this whole idea of this socialist, welfarist state,
Fair.
pacifism from Gandhi, etc. Now, all of them wanted to create wanted to create an ancient lineage for themselves. Now the problem is that Chanakya doesn't provide you this.
No.
Nor does subsequent rulers. Not Shivaji clearly doesn't provide you this.
Right.
Prithviraj
Chauhan does not.
Chauhan doesn't. Krishna Deva Raya doesn't.
Right.
So they grabbed onto this king called Ashoka, who had just been recently rediscovered by the British historians, particularly actually an East India Company official called Princep. But anyway, so they latched onto this guy. His inscriptions had just been rediscovered. And it had a few lines here and there which suggested that he was much into this pacifism type thing. So they took that. They took into also liked the fact that he had all this very expansionist, Mai Baap Sarkar attitude, which of course fitted in well with the Nehruvian socialism.
Right.
So therefore you created this Ashoka the Great as a sort of
as an intellectual father
to this whole thing, to this project. So he then was created as the great Ashoka. And then, so it's a purely 20th century phenomena. And then you basically twisted his history to talk about his conversion to Buddhism, etc. All of this is garbage. There is no evidence of this. In fact, the evidence is clear that he was a Buddhist before this invasion. And so then he became this great important person. And so his symbols are then taken on to becoming the symbols of the state, etc. Now, despite my somewhat suspicion of Ashoka, I, however, think inadvertently they did the right thing. So let me explain why. You see, the wheel and the chakra is not Ashoka's. We call it the Ashoka chakra, but the symbol of the wheel as a symbol of the state predates Ashoka.
It's the Dharma chakra.
It is the Dharma chakra, but the Raj Dharma chakra. It has nothing to do with Buddhism. So let me understand this. The Indian state, the concept of the universal monarch is that of the Chakravartin.
Right.
Yes, Chakravartin Samrat. Goes back all the way to the Rig Veda to, the first Chakravartin, who was Sudasa, the chieftain of the Bharata tribe, after whom our kingdom is named.
Right.
Subsequently, there are many, the Raja Bharat, and many others who do they
fall under the Chakravartin category.
Yeah, they become Chakravartin. What is their symbol? Their symbol is the wheel. So there are all great emperors would have the wheel as a symbol. Even the Guptas have the wheel.
Right.
Okay, and this is a symbol of royalty. So the Buddhists use it because Buddha in the spiritual realm is the universal monarch. That is, he's the Chakravartin in the spiritual realm. So the Buddhists are using the symbol as well, but they are also appropriating a pre-existing symbol.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now think about what is going on here. You go to Sarnath. Why is Sarnath important? Because the two most important highways of that time, the Uttara Path and the Dakshina Path, cross here. So it was a highway crossing. Now imagine the scene. You have a huge pillar with these growling lions looking down at you with these symbols of the wheel. Nothing to do with Buddhism. This is about the power of the state. Okay, whether it's Ashoka, it may even have been put up by Bindusara or even by Chandragupta, for all we know. But what are the Mauryans saying? At the crossroads of the two most important highways, I have these growling lions looking down of you. They are basically in four directions. The Chakravartin's power
watches everything everywhere.
Yes.
Right.
That is what is the symbol of the state. It's the symbol of the power of the state. Okay, we have converted into this fuzzy, some Buddhist type thing. It is not. Okay.
Very interesting.
So it has the chakra, the symbol of the state. The lions growling at you from above, big ones. I mean, if you go to Sarnath, these are not small. It's not a small thing. It's a pretty large, monumental thing on top of a pillar, looking down at you. And where would you put it? You would put it at the place where the biggest crossroad in your of highways of that time. Right. So this is what it is. So it is a symbol of the power of the state. So whether consciously or unconsciously, we did the right thing. We took on a symbol of the state. After all, what is the state? What is the republic? A state is the power of the state is that it has monopoly over violence.
Right. This is Max Weber.
Yeah, that is what a state is.
Right.
So that's what it is.
You know, in the Vipassana tradition, they actually talk about this. And so when I was first introduced, I thought, why is there an Ashoka Chakra here? But they talk about it as the Dharma Chakra or the Dhamma Chakra.
It is
in
not
Pali.
the Dharma Chakra at all.
Uh-huh.
It is the Raj Dharma Chakra.
Fair.
Okay,
Fair.
this is and by the way, this symbol is there also if you go and look at Gupta sites, you will also find it.
Right. And it's so symbolic of the dharmic sort of tradition of things where time is circular and, you know, the
Yes.
karma and dharma is circular as...
But it is also a symbol of the chariot of the Chakravartin who can drive his chariot in any direction.
That's so interesting. From
And by the
power
way-
and spirituality.
Yeah,
right?
and so the Kharavela, who was the Udiya king, who destroyed the Mughal of the Mauryan Empire, when Kharvel comes to power, he also conducts the Rajasuya Yagya and declares himself the Chakravartin.
Right. Isn't the Ashwamedh Yagya also in...
Yeah, they are
right,
basically they are both to declare the Chakravartin.
Right.
One of them involves the horse going around, etc. And the Rajasuya is a
Fire.
Yeah, it's a fire sacrifice. So
Right.
both of them are basically ways of declaring yourself as Chakravartin.
Interesting.
So, and it is all, and the symbol of the person who successfully carries out this process,
enterprise, yes.
enterprise, it then becomes the
Chakravartin, the
Chakravartin
supreme
Samrat.
ruler. Fair.
The Chakravartin Samrat then is the universal monarch because his chariot can drive in any direction
And nobody can interrupt.
and nobody can interrupt him. So
Right.
this is the Chakravartin.
Fair.
So it is therefore the symbol of the state. And so when the Buddhists come, remember what happens with Buddha when he is very small. A rishi comes and says this child will definitely become a Chakravartin. But he may become a Chakravartin in the
Spiritual
sense or as a great conqueror.
Right.
And his father basically wants him to be a great conqueror. So you see, but he becomes in the spiritual space. But he is a universal monarch in that space.
Right.
But what are the Buddhists doing? There already is a conception of a universal monarch whose
Right.
symbol is the Chakravartin, and they are appropriating it.
Right. Very interesting.
And in modern times, we instinctively understand what it is.
Yes.
So even though we do it for the wrong reason, which is Ashoka, etc.,
We latch on to the right
we latch on to the correct symbol,
right.
which is that there are these growling lions looking down at us. So, again, one of the funny and almost hilarious things we do is that in this sort of pursuit of so-called, we discover that these growling lions aren't too peaceful. It kind of violates our self-image.
Right.
So, in the Nehruvian period, if you look at buildings built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, including, for example, the lions on top of the Vidhan Sauda in Bengaluru for Karnataka's legislative assembly.
Right.
The lion's mouth is shut. So they stop them from growling because they're not peaceful enough.
Right. Okay. Very interesting how that works. Huh?
Yeah. So therefore, now what happens is, now we build a new thing. We got them to back to growling.
Because we're back.
We're
right?
back.
Like we're back in that flavor. One last question, sir, and then I'll leave you to it. Intellectually, I already understand Kamandak sort of takes Chanakya forward.
Yes.
What is the intellectual lineage from there, if there is any?
So this is very interesting. So, we tend to think of Kautilya as,
this isolated.
standalone.
Yeah.
No, Kautilya is already, by the time he arrives in the scene, there is a well-developed, as I pointed out, thought and schools of thought from Brihaspati, Shukra, Manu, others as well. He mentions a few more. Now, this tradition continues. So the Mauryan Empire goes, but the fascination with the Mauryas remain. And one of those who are most fascinated with it is, of course, the Guptas. They also create an empire. Samudragupta goes and sort of goes all the way to the southern tip. He defeats, just like they had defeated the Yavanas, the Greeks. They are defeating the descendants of the Greeks, the Indo-Greeks, the Bactrians, the Saks and Sakas.
Right.
So they see themselves in the same light. And so you have plays like the Mudra Rakshas, where they talk about how Chanakya won the throne from the Nandas.
Right.
So, three of the kings of the Guptas are called
Chandragupta.
Chandragupta. So they are fascinated by the Mauryas.
Right.
And they, in the same tradition, you also have Kamandak, who is the philosopher of the Guptas.
Right.
And so he starts by saying that how much he admires Chanakya. So many of his thoughts he puts down. Although I personally think Kamandak is not of the same caliber as Chanakya. But still, he takes many of the same ideas, updates them in various ways to his times. He changes, I mean, there is obviously, for example, he talks about military strategies. And you can see the military strategies have changed over 600 years.
Right.
And so on and so forth. And so you can clearly see the continuation. And you see in many other places also, there is mention of Chanakya. Now, these ideas remain floating around. So even in the Maratha Empire, there's a fascination with Chanakya. So there is always, there are traditions of thought that are still around. But they are slowly kind of getting diluted, and the original copies of his of Arthashastra are becoming fewer and fewer. And in the 19th century, it's believed that they have been completely lost.
Okay.
So he's only known from the fact that there are all these legends about it, but there is no Arthashastra. Then one copy is found in the Mysore library. Okay, about 100 years ago. And from that, of course, later on a few more were found, but one proper copy was found. And from that, we begin to then rediscover
the tradition.
Yeah, so now other copies have been found, etc. Some better than others.
Right.
But the main one that is still the one that is used is the one that was found in the Mysore library. So the whole thing was nearly lost. But the important thing here is, and sad I would say, there are actually lakhs and lakhs of palm leaf documents and manuscripts written in Sanskrit and also other languages, Indian languages, that have not been translated. So it is entirely possible that somewhere in the country there are other texts on governance, etc., that exist. It is very sad that because of lack of epigraphy, lack of hard work, whatever it may be. So if there are translators, scholars, etc., please go there, contact the National
Archives.
Manuscript Mission. There are lots and lots of documents out there for young scholars to engage with, and literally lakhs of documents which we have no idea what is in there. So there may be huge amounts of knowledge that are just lying around.
I knew there were some intranslatable documents.
No, there are lots of them, and some of it requires effort because they are in scripts that are not widely used. But somebody has to put in that effort. After all, I mean, to be fair to the British, even if they were digging up our history to twist it for their own good,
right,
for their own reasons, they put in an effort.
Right.
And during their rule, there were scholars who did do original work. But after independence, this was all discouraged.
Discouraged. Not discontinued.
No, not just discontinued, discouraged.
Because?
So you had, there were many things. One of them is this embarrassment with India's past.
Interesting.
So you see, for example, you have great archaeologists like B.B. Lal in the 50s and 60s. They do a lot of interesting digs. For example, in epic Ramayana, Mahabharata related sites. And then it is all stopped. By the 70s, no more. Our entire, history, archaeology, manuscripts, etc., all of this kind of stalls.
Interesting.
And it is surprising that till my colleague Bibek Debroy began to really do many of these afresh from an Indian perspective of, translating Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc., much of what had been done was 100 years old.
Wow.
So,
and that by the British.
Done under British rule, not necessarily by the British.
Right, fair.
You had Manmat Nath, Datta and all these people. But, it happened under British rule. And then it stalled for the, half a century or more in post-independence India. It's only in the last decade or so, there's been this new resurgence of interest.
Right.
But I want to tell young people who are there is so much out there that left to dig, even for amateurs.
Fair.
Okay,
Wow.
Even if you are, one of those people who has learned Sanskrit in college.
Like a Reddit historian.
Yeah, and but you're willing to take it up seriously, learn, the script and so on. There are lots of documents, even on, you can get a lot of them have been digitized, they're online. Pick them up, begin to do your research. You'll be amazed how much information is there which we have no idea about. Literally lakhs of such
A
documents.
civilization waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, sir. Thank you so much for your time. As always, it is such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If you're passionate about conversations like this, and if you think, Prakhar, I'd like to listen to more conversations like this, then I must tell you, there is a subscribe button right here and a bell icon right next to it. And it's your moral obligation to press that. Press the subscribe button and I'll see you around for more conversations just like this.